In the winter of 208 AD, along the muddy banks of the Yangtze River, the largest army ancient China had ever seen prepared to cross into legend. What happened next would shatter an empire, forge three kingdoms, and change the course of Chinese civilization forever. This was not merely a battle for territory or riches. This was a clash between the dying breath of a dynasty and the birth of an age that would echo through eternity. Picture this scene. Nearly 250,000 soldiers stretching across the horizon like a living sea of bronze and steel. War banners snapping in the winter wind. The thunder of horses and the groans of supply wagons carrying enough provisions to feed a city. At the head of this unstoppable tide marched Cao Cao, the most feared warlord in all of China. His eyes fixed on a prize that had eluded conquerors for generations, total dominion over the Middle Kingdom. But standing in his path were forces that would prove far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Not because of their numbers, for they were vastly outnumbered. Not because of their weapons, for they were outmatched in every conventional sense. But because they possessed something that would turn the waters of the Yangtze into a furnace and transform certain defeat into miraculous victory. The year 208 marked the end of an era that had lasted nearly 4 centuries. The mighty Han Dynasty, once the greatest empire on earth, was crumbling like ancient parchment. Regional warlords carved up the realm like vultures feasting on a carcass. The emperor himself was nothing more than a puppet, a frightened child clutching a throne that no longer commanded respect. In this chaos, ambitious men saw opportunity, and none were more ambitious than Cao Cao. By 208 AD, Cao Cao had methodically conquered the entire northern half of China through a series of brilliant campaigns that left his rivals crushed and scattered. His victory at the Battle of Guandu had eliminated his greatest northern competitor. His defeat of the Wuhuan tribes at White Wolf Mountain had secured his flanks. Now, with the north firmly under his iron grip, only one prize remained: the lush, prosperous lands of the south, where 2 warlords still dared to defy his authority, Liu Bei and Sun Quan. These names would become legendary, but in 208, they were merely obstacles standing between Cao Cao and his destiny. Liu Bei, a distant relative of the imperial family, claimed legitimacy through royal blood. Sun Quan, barely in his 20s, ruled the wealthy river valleys through inherited power. Both commanded forces that seemed laughably small compared to Cao Cao's massive army. Yet neither showed any inclination to surrender. The stage was set for what should have been a simple conquest. Cao Cao's overwhelming numbers would crush all resistance, unite China under his banner, and establish a new dynasty that would last for centuries. The southern warlords would bend the knee or perish. History seemed inevitable, but history, as we shall see, had other plans. As autumn gave way to winter in 208, Cao Cao's colossal army began its march south. The sight was beyond imagination. According to Cao Cao's own estimates, 800,000 warriors followed his banners. Even modern scholars, who dismiss this as propaganda, acknowledge that at least 250,000 soldiers tramped through the Chinese countryside toward their fateful appointment with destiny. This was not merely an army. It was a migration of steel and flesh. Cavalry units from the northern steppes rode alongside veteran infantry who had conquered kingdoms. Siege engineers hauled massive catapults and battering rams. Supply trains stretched for miles, carrying everything from weapons to winter clothing to medical supplies. The very earth trembled under their passage. Yet for all its impressive size, this mighty host carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Many of the soldiers were recent conscripts, pressed into service from newly conquered territories. Their loyalty was questionable at best. Others were forced laborers, non-combatants who swelled the numbers but added little fighting strength. Most critically, these northern warriors had no experience with naval warfare. They were cavalry and infantry, trained for battles on dry land, not the treacherous waters of the Yangtze River system. As winter deepened and the army pushed further south, other problems emerged. The enormous size that was supposed to guarantee victory became a liability. Supplies ran short. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Men who had marched hundreds of miles without rest began to show signs of exhaustion and demoralization. By the time they reached the approaches to the Yangtze, Cao Cao's seemingly invincible force was already showing cracks. But Cao Cao pressed forward, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm any resistance. After all, what could 50,000 Southerners do against 250,000 Northerners? The answer to that question would soon be written in fire and blood across the waters of Red Cliffs. The Southern alliance that formed to resist Cao Cao's invasion was born of desperation and mutual necessity. Liu Bei and Sun Quan had been rivals, competing for influence and territory in the fractured landscape of southern China. Under normal circumstances, they might have fought each other while Cao Cao picked off the survivor. But these were not normal circumstances. Liu Bei had already tasted defeat at Cao Cao's hands. At the Battle of Changban, his forces had been scattered and he himself had barely escaped capture. His army was broken, his resources depleted, and his future uncertain. Alone, he stood no chance against the approaching northern tide. Sun Quan, despite controlling the wealthy river valleys of the southeast, could field only about 50,000 troops. His kingdom was prosperous but militarily outnumbered by a factor of 5 to 1. The mathematics of survival forced these former rivals into an uneasy partnership. Neither could stand alone, but together they might have a chance. The alliance was sealed through a combination of diplomatic necessity and strategic brilliance. Liu Bei sent his master strategist, the legendary Zhuge Liang, to negotiate with Sun Quan's court. Meanwhile, Sun Quan's advisors debated whether to fight or surrender. The decision to fight came down to a single crucial advantage that the Southern Alliance possessed. While Cao Cao's massive army was trained for land battles, the Southerners were masters of river warfare. They had grown up on the waters of the Yangtze and its tributaries. They knew every current, every seasonal change, every tactical possibility that the great river offered. This knowledge would prove more valuable than all of Cao Cao's numerical superiority. Zhou Yu emerged as the key figure in the southern resistance. At 33 years old, he was already recognized as one of China's most brilliant military commanders. Tall, physically imposing, and possessing what chroniclers described as a beautiful appearance, Zhou Yu combined personal charisma with strategic genius. He saw what others missed. Where most generals looked at Cao Cao's enormous army and saw certain defeat, Zhou Yu saw opportunity. The northern army, Zhou Yu realized, had critical weaknesses that could be exploited. Their cavalry and infantry had no experience fighting on water. They were exhausted from their long march and demoralized by disease and supply shortages. Most importantly, they would have to rely on ships to cross the Yangtze, and ships could burn. As Cao Cao's forces reached the northern banks of the Great River, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Chinese history. The largest army ever assembled in ancient China faced a much smaller but determined alliance across the dark waters of the Yangtze. Neither side fully understood what was about to unfold, but both knew that the fate of China hung in the balance. The winter winds were picking up strength, and somewhere in the southern camp, a veteran general named Huang Gai was forming a plan that would turn those winds into instruments of devastation. The mystery of Red Cliffs begins not with the battle itself, but with a question that has puzzled historians for over 13 centuries. Where exactly did this world-changing confrontation take place? The name Red Cliffs suggests towering crimson bluffs overlooking the Yangtze, yet no one can say with certainty which Red Cliffs witnessed the flames that would reshape an empire. Scholars have debated this puzzle for over a millennium, proposing locations from Jiayu in Hubei province to sites near modern Wuhan. The Yangtze River itself has shifted course countless times since 208 AD, swallowing potential archaeological evidence beneath its muddy depths. Ancient place names have changed, landmarks have vanished, and the very geography that witnessed this epic confrontation has been transformed by time and nature's relentless march. What we do know is this. Somewhere along the middle reaches of the mighty Yangtze, in the heart of what is now Hubei province, two armies prepared for a battle that neither truly understood. The setting was perfect for naval warfare. Broad stretches of water flanked by towering bluffs, narrow channels that could funnel attacking forces into killing zones, and seasonal winds that could carry both ships and flames with devastating speed. As winter deepened in 208, Cao Cao's massive army reached the northern banks of the Yangtze and beheld the challenge that lay before them. The great river stretched wide and dark, its waters swollen by recent rains. On the far shore, the banners of the Southern Alliance fluttered in the cold wind. Between them lay not just a river, but a watery grave that would soon claim thousands. Cao Cao's first decision would prove catastrophic, though he could not have known it at the time. Recognizing that his northern soldiers were unused to fighting on water, he ordered his warships to be chained together. This, he reasoned, would create stable platforms that would prevent seasickness and allow his men to fight as if they were on solid ground. The massive vessels were lashed side by side with heavy iron chains, forming floating fortresses that seemed impregnable. To Cao Cao and his generals, this innovation appeared brilliant. The chained ships would not rock with the waves. Soldiers could move easily from vessel to vessel. Cavalry horses could even be transported on these stable platforms. What they had created, they believed, was an unbeatable naval force that combined the best of land and sea warfare. But across the river, Zhou Yu and his allied commanders saw something entirely different. Where Cao Cao saw stability and strength, they saw vulnerability. The chained ships could not maneuver independently. If one caught fire, the flames would spread inevitably to all the others. What Cao Cao considered his greatest tactical advantage would become the instrument of his destruction southern strategy. They began to take shape around a single, audacious idea. Fire, the element that had been humanity's servant since the dawn of civilization, would become their weapon of mass destruction. But executing a fire attack against a wary enemy required more than just burning ships. It required deception, courage, and a willingness to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. Enter Huang Gai, a veteran general whose name would echo through the centuries. Born into poverty and orphaned at a young age, Huang Gai had clawed his way up through the ranks, through sheer determination and military skill. He had served 3 generations of the Sun family, earning a reputation for loyalty and tactical brilliance. Now, in the darkest hour of the Southern Alliance, he would propose a plan so dangerous that it bordered on suicide. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Huang Gai would pretend to defect to Cao Cao's side, approaching the northern fleet under the pretense of surrender. His ships would be loaded not with soldiers and supplies, but with kindling, dry reeds, and oil. When the moment was right, he would set these vessels ablaze and send them crashing into Cao Cao's chained fleet like floating infernos. Everything had to be perfect. The wind had to be blowing in the right direction to carry the fire ships toward the enemy. Cao Cao had to believe that Huang Gai's defection was genuine. The timing had to be precise, allowing just enough time for the fire ships to reach their target before the flames consumed the vessels completely. A single mistake would mean not just the failure of the plan, but the certain death of Huang Gai and his volunteers. Zhou Yu recognized the brilliance of the strategy, but also its risks. If the deception was discovered, Huang Gai would be captured and executed, and the Southern Alliance would lose one of its most experienced commanders. If the winds shifted at the wrong moment, the fire ships might drift harmlessly away from their targets. If Cao Cao's scouts detected the true nature of the approaching vessels too early, the entire northern fleet could scatter before the trap was sprung. Yet they had no choice. The southern forces were outnumbered by at least 4 to 1. In a conventional battle, they would be crushed beneath the weight of Cao Cao's massive army. Only through cunning and desperate courage could they hope to level the playing field. The fire attack represented their one chance to turn Cao Cao's greatest strength, his enormous chained fleet, into his greatest weakness. As the winter winds began to shift, blowing steadily from the southeast toward Cao Cao's position, Zhou Yu gave his approval. Huang Gai began his preparations, selecting the vessels that would carry fire into the heart of the enemy fleet. These were not ordinary ships, but specially prepared instruments of destruction. The holds were packed with bundles of kindling and dried grass. Oil was poured over everything that could burn. Hidden beneath innocent-looking cargo were the materials that would transform the Yangtze into a sea of flames. The letter that Huang Gai composed to Cao Cao was a masterpiece of deception. Written in the tone of a defeated general seeking to save his own life, it offered to bring valuable intelligence about the Southern Alliance's weaknesses and defensive positions. The message played perfectly into Cao Cao's expectations. Of course, the Southern commanders would begin defecting as they realized the hopelessness of their position. Of course, a veteran like Huang Gai would choose pragmatic survival over hopeless loyalty. What Cao Cao could not see was the trap being prepared across the dark waters of the Yangtze. In the southern camps, final preparations were underway for an attack that would transform the largest army in Chinese history into a funeral pyre. The winds were right, the enemy was positioned perfectly, and the stage was set for one of the most spectacular military disasters in human history. The night before the attack, Huang Gai made his final preparations. Tomorrow, he would sail into the jaws of death, carrying with him the hopes of the entire Southern Alliance and the future of China itself. The dawn of that fateful winter morning brought with it an eerie stillness that seemed to hold the very breath of heaven. Across the dark waters of the Yangtze, Cao Cao's massive chained fleet sat like a city of wood and iron, its countless banners hanging limp in the motionless air. The northern soldiers moved about their floating fortresses with the confidence of men who believed victory was already assured. After all, what could a handful of southern rebels do against the might of nearly 250,000 warriors? But in the Allied camps across the river, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Zhou Yu paced the shoreline, his keen eyes scanning the sky for the first signs of the wind shift that would signal the moment to strike. Every detail of the plan had been rehearsed, every contingency considered, yet he knew that success would ultimately depend on forces beyond human control. The wind, the current, the enemy's reaction, all of these variables could spell either triumph or catastrophe. Huang Gai stood beside his prepared fire ships, their innocent appearance masking the deadly cargo within. To any casual observer, they looked like ordinary merchant vessels loaded with supplies and trade goods. Canvas covered the holds where oil-soaked kindling waited like sleeping dragons. The veteran general's weathered face showed no trace of the fear that must have gnawed at his heart. He had volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. As the morning sun climbed higher, a subtle change began to stir the air. The banners on Cao Cao's ship started to flutter, then wave more vigorously as the wind picked up strength. It was blowing from the southeast, directly toward the northern fleet. Zhou Yu felt his pulse quicken. The moment they had been waiting for was approaching. The deception began with a carefully orchestrated display of surrender. Huang Gai's small flotilla pushed off from the southern shore, their sails unfurled, and their approach deliberately slow and non-threatening. From a distance, Cao Cao's sentries watched the approaching vessels with mild curiosity rather than alarm. The letter announcing Huang Gai's defection had already been delivered, and the northern commanders expected nothing more than a routine transfer of allegiance. What they could not see was the deadly transformation taking place aboard those seemingly innocent ships. As the vessels drew closer to the midpoint of the river, Huang Gai's men began their final preparations. Hidden beneath the canvas coverings, they spread the last of the oil and arranged the kindling for maximum effect. Small boats trailed behind the fire ships, ready to carry the attackers to safety once the flames were lit. The wind continued to strengthen, and Zhou Yu knew the moment had arrived. He gave the signal, and across the water, Huang Gai raised a torch high above his head. The sight sent a thrill of anticipation through the southern ranks. Everything now depended on the courage of one man and the favor of the elements. Huang Gai's voice carried across the water as he shouted the words that would seal Cao Cao's fate. "We surrender. We come to join the great chancellor." The cry was taken up by his men, and from the northern ships came answering shouts of welcome. Cao Cao's soldiers emerged from their quarters to witness what they believed was the beginning of the southern collapse. But as the distance between the fire ships and their targets shrank to mere hundreds of yards, Huang Gai made his move. The torch in his hand touched the oil-soaked materials, and instantly the first ship erupted into flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing through the prepared kindling and transforming the vessel into a floating inferno. One by one, the other ships ignited, creating a squadron of blazing death bearing down on Cao Cao's chained fleet. The reaction from the northern ships was immediate and catastrophic. Shouts of alarm replaced cries of welcome as the true nature of the approaching vessels became unmistakably clear. But it was already too late. The fire ships, driven by the strong southeast wind, raced toward their targets like arrows shot from the bow of a giant. The first impact came with a sound like thunder. A burning ship crashed into the side of one of Cao Cao's largest vessels, and the flames leaped hungrily from wood to wood. The iron chains that Cao Cao had thought would be his salvation now became the instruments of his destruction. As one ship caught fire, the flames spread inexorably to its chained neighbors, then to theirs, creating a domino effect of destruction that no human force could stop. Panic erupted throughout the northern fleet. Soldiers who had never fought on water found themselves trapped on burning ships with nowhere to flee. Those who leaped into the river discovered that their heavy armor dragged them down into the dark waters. The lucky few who could swim faced the terrible choice between drowning and burning alive. The scene was beyond imagination. What had moments before been an orderly fleet of warships became a hellish landscape of fire and smoke. The flames reached toward the winter sky like the fingers of demons, and the screams of dying men echoed across the water. The wind that had carried the fire ships to their target now fanned the flames higher, turning individual blazes into a single massive conflagration. Cao Cao himself stood transfixed on the deck of his command ship, watching his dreams of empire literally go up in smoke. The man who had conquered half of China, who had defeated every enemy that dared face him in battle, was helpless before the elemental fury that consumed his fleet. His advisors shouted for him to abandon ship, but for long moments he could only stare at the destruction of everything he had worked to build. The fire spread beyond the chained warships to the supply vessels and troop transports anchored nearby. Months of carefully gathered provisions, weapons that had armed conquest, siege engines that had breached the walls of cities, all of it fed the hungry flames. The smoke rose so thick and black that it blotted out the sun, turning day into an apocalyptic twilight. But the catastrophe was far from over. As Zhou Yu had calculated, the flames soon spread to the Northern Army's camps on the riverbank. The fire leaped from ship to shore like a living thing, devouring everything in its path. Tents, supply wagons, and wooden fortifications became fuel for the Inferno. Soldiers who had escaped the burning ships found themselves facing the same deadly enemy on land. The Southern Alliance wasted no time pressing their advantage. As smoke and confusion paralyzed the northern forces, Zhou Yu launched a full assault on the demoralized enemy. War drums thundered across the water as the Allied fleet emerged from behind the screen of smoke, their soldiers screaming battle cries as they closed for combat. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The Northern Army, already reeling from the fire attack, could mount no organized resistance. Units that tried to form defensive lines found themselves surrounded and cut down. Officers who attempted to rally their men were swept away by the tide of fleeing soldiers. The disciplined war machine that had conquered half of China disintegrated into a panicked mob. The pursuit continued through the day and into the night. Cao Cao's forces, those who survived the flames and the initial assault, fled northward along muddy roads that quickly became clogged with desperate men. The winter rains that followed turned retreat into a nightmare of suffering that claimed more lives than the battle itself. Soldiers drowned in the mud, collapsed from exhaustion, or were trampled by their own comrades in the desperate rush to escape. By the time the sun set on that winter day, the largest army in Chinese history had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing for their lives. The man who had seemed destined to unite all of China under his rule was himself a fugitive, his grand ambitions reduced to ashes floating on the dark waters of the Yangtze. But the true significance of Red Cliffs would only become clear in the years that followed, as the victory that should have lasted a single day instead shaped the destiny of Chinese civilization for generations to come.